Hi everyone, thank you very much for watching or listening. Liam Hartree here today with another episode of Simply Inspired Podcast. Today, joined by a very special guest who I'm very honored, very blessed to actually have on the show today. This lady is truly inspirational in the true sense of the word. That is a word that is thrown around too often, I feel, but in this particular case, very apt. Today's guest, Lourdes Elva, TED Talk speaker, public speaker, author, playwright, and activist for gender equality, author of the book South of Forgiveness, has produced short films with regards to gender equality, consent, other topics, was voted Woman of the Year, the Federation of Icelandic Women's Societies in 2015, front runner of the Me Too movement, as well as quite a bit more. I also need to mention that she is also the founder, I believe, of the Nordic Digital Rights and Equality Foundation. So today we're going to be talking about Thoris's life in a way that it is hopefully not being portrayed before, as the story has been extensively documented, but today we should have a different spin on things. Before we get into any of that, thank you, Thoris, once again for coming on the show. As I mentioned earlier, it is a real pleasure to have you, so thank you for making the time for this.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for that kind introduction.
Well, that's okay. I mean, hopefully I haven't missed anything because you have accomplished so much. So obviously a pleasure to have you here. Now, a lot of people will have heard the story, will have read the book, heard you on TED Talks, on various interviews you've conducted on the BBC, on so many large platforms. So, as I mentioned to you at the beginning, I don't really want to dwell on what happened, but going back to um, where your story began from a certain perspective, at least, with Tom, survivor of sexual violence, everything that happened there. Feel free to give us a brief rundown of the situation if you'd like to, for anyone who doesn't know about it. But I'd prefer to focus more on the immediate aftermath of your healing after surviving a rape, basically from someone you trusted deeply. How did you learn to trust again, to endeavor to take part in intimacy? And by that, by no means, I don't mean the sexual side only, but in trust, closeness with whoever it is, or the people you were dating after that time, because that is something that, to the best of my knowledge, hasn't been discussed a great deal. And yet is a pivotal part of your story, not so much to dwell on what happened, but the beginnings of how you turned it into a positive. So, long waffling question, I'm sorry, but in simple terms, please can you walk us through your healing immediately after the incident?
Wow, thank you. That's an excellent question. And it also feels respectful in the sense that often when we who are open about our experiences of sexual violence, us as survivors, are invited to come and speak on platforms like yours, we often walk away feeling like we were somewhat reduced down to the worst thing that happened to us. And that, of course, is not healthy for your self-image and certainly not a propeller of healing. So I'm so appreciative that the first question that you ask is about that, the aftermath, and the hope that people can have that even despite something terrible happening to you that is traumatizing for sure when it takes place, despite that having been a part of your life process, there's hope that joy can be found again, intimacy can be found again, trust can be found again. But it is a journey. And my journey began when I was 16, and I fell for this exchange student at my school who happened to be from the exact other side of the planet. So I'm from Iceland. I'm sitting here giving this interview in Reykjavik, the northernmost capital in the world. And this young man who was 18 at the time was from a small town outside of Sydney, if I remember correctly, but basically other side of the planet. Very exotic, I felt at the time. I'd never had a boyfriend before, and he was soft-spoken, eloquent, charmed my mother, honor student, ticked all the boxes, and I fell hard for him, felt very grown up, first time in my life. And there was a school dance And for the first time ever, I had someone to take me to it. So that felt adult in a way that I'd never felt before. So it felt like a natural next step to also try alcohol for the first time. That was disastrous. I did not know how to handle it. I was a child. Drank way too much, way too fast, incapacitated myself essentially. Ended up being very ill and not able to move a limb or utter a word. I was probably, alcohol poisoned in hindsight with today's knowledge. But that's not something I knew at the time. I just remember feeling very frustrated. I could not control my body and I could not make my mouth say the words I wanted to utter, which were words of thanks, as my boyfriend swooped me up from the toilet floor and took me in a taxi home and tucked me in what I thought would be, a night's sleep, and I would wake up with my first hangover. But what he did instead was to remove my clothing and have sex with me without consent, which is, of course, rape. And I did not know that at the time. I had very cliche, stereotypical misconceptions about what a sexual assailant is and how that takes place. I thought, boogeyman in a dark alley, basically, someone that lurks in a parking lot or behind a bush and like jumps at you. Certainly not your eloquent honor student boyfriend, certainly not in your own bed. And despite it being painful and drawn out and a massive betrayal, I did not put the pieces together and realize that what I'd been through was sexual assault until quite a long time later. And by that time, Tom, my boyfriend, had completed his exchange student program and was already on the other side of the planet. So I never had that opportunity to do anything, take any specific course of action with this. I didn't have the chance to press charges. In Iceland at the time, what I just described was not defined as rape legally, so I would never have had a case of rape to pursue, even if circumstances would have been different, even if Tom would still have been in the country. So none of those options were open to me, which left me with all of this hurt and no closure, no ability to or chance to confront this matter, no access to my perpetrator because he was long gone. This is before social media. I had no specific reason to think I'd ever see him again, or that we would even be in contact in any shape or form. So I think I did what most people in that situation would do, which was to try and leave it behind me and try and move on and, build myself up again. And that didn't take on a healthy manifestation for me. I developed many unhealthy coping mechanisms. It was destructive for a long time. I did quite a lot of trying to outrun my past by just piling things onto my schedule until it was completely unsustainable. Just a very clear-cut recipe for workaholism and burnout and things that we now know are really bad for your health and psyche. But I did that at the time, and I developed just negative, harmful behaviors towards my body, towards alcohol, towards lots of things. And of course, this created tension in my relationships and just overall did not lead to a happy, balanced life where I felt that I could be in any way the best version of myself, for sure. That said, I did find ways to somewhat process. I was writing a lot. I started to hone in on the issue of sexual violence. I started to write articles about it. It started to sift into my playwriting. So I was dabbling with it and approaching it in artistic mediums and in other ways, but it wasn't until I was 25, which is 9 years later, so almost a decade later, that To my surprise, one day when I was in an upset state, I had just had a fight with a loved one and I'd stormed out the door and I was just going to doodle in my notebook to calm my nerves. And what ended up happening was this letter just streaming out of the pen to Tom, my perpetrator. And this letter was basically a confrontation. It basically placed the responsibility that I had wrongfully carried for almost a decade on his shoulders. And it was basically an empowering way for me to take back my autonomy, in the sense that that was never yours to do to me. That was never your right. You did not have a right to my body. Despite us being in a relationship, you always have to seek consent. You did not do so in that circumstance. That makes it wrong. That makes it violent. I did not deserve that. So things like that, that I stated that were fundamental to my healing. But I also found myself a bit scared when I read through this surprising letter that I'd not consciously been concocting. So it seems that it came from somewhere deeper, like my subconscious had been working on this for a while. But a fear arose when I read through it, and I thought, this is a really precious newfound voice that I did not know I had. What do I do with it? Like, do I try and communicate this and actually send this letter, risking that my perpetrator may respond in a way that's not constructive, risking that he may deny this, risking that he may call me a liar, risking that he may not reply to me and leave me wondering for the rest of my life what could have been, that sort of thing. And all of these were scary scenarios. Obviously, I did not want to set myself up for more hurt, which is why I don't recommend for survivors to engage with their abusers. I always recommend for people to just prioritize their own safety and well-being. But having thought through all of this, I decided to send the letter eventually, because I felt that it was worth giving myself that opportunity, that platform, that giving this newfound voice of mine wings, basically, to just state that this was not my fault. And to my surprise, I did get a reply from Tom, who owned up to it wholeheartedly, confessed without any like attempt to minimize or normalize or deflect any of the responsibility. So that was mind-blowing. That was the last thing I thought would happen. And it prompted me asking the million-dollar question, I suppose, that most survivors, if not all, harbor at some point, which is why. Like, why did you do this to me? Because I think that it's in human nature to want to make sense of your pain. Like, pain is even harder to bear if it makes no sense, if it's nonsensical and futile it feels. So I think that wanting to comprehend, wanting to understand better the root causes of your pain, it was like, illogical as they may be, because of course there's no logical answer to why would you sexually assault someone. So illogical as they may be, it's something, right? And something is better than nothing when you've been suffering for a long time. So I guess that's why I found it compelling to pose that question. And Tom replied, so we had a long correspondence that stretched out over 8 years. It wasn't in continuous, like it did have breaks. There were at least 2 breaks that were long, I think over a year long. But it was rekindled and reignited a few times when we discovered something that was of relevance to the analysis we were conducting. We were conducting an analysis of what makes an 18-year-old boy make a decision that he essentially knows is wrong, and how does that affect not just the person he does it to, but also the person he becomes through that action, you know? So that was a very grand, long, intricate, painful, and yet enlightening process that was simultaneously a process of responsibility being transferred. and being shouldered by the person to whom it rightfully belonged. So to answer your question, and I know I went about it in quite a long-winded way, but I think I managed to pack in a lot of the history in there. To answer your question, a lot of my healing actually took place through that analysis and through that transference of responsibility, where I was shedding it, where I was putting down burdens that were never mine. That was empowering, it was a relief. And when people wonder, do you actually need a perpetrator to do that, to have this type of exchange with? My answer is no, you don't. You don't need a perpetrator to do that. And to anyone who's listening, we can all be the person that helps a survivor process. We can all be the person that says, I believe you, it wasn't your fault. I know you did nothing to deserve this. I'm here to listen if you want to talk. Like, these are all things that we all can do for each other, and particularly for this population of people who've already been let down and been disempowered and had their control taken from them. So to hold that space and give them that power back by just being there for them and believing them is tremendously healing.
Wow, that is, I mean, I knew that would be a powerful answer, but there's a lot contained within there, and I'm very happy with that because of the life advice, you know, the lessons that you've learned that people can apply from the situation. Yes, it does pack in a lot of the history, so thank you for that as well. Obviously, the next step to that really is when you actually met with Tom, and again, this is well documented, so not to sort of dwell on this, but focusing on the forgiveness aspect. In the end, you chose to work with him, obviously with the book and the talks and different things, as opposed to take a more punitive action, press charges, as you mentioned earlier, go down these sorts of lines. This is talked about quite a bit, but I'm interested to get into what the forgiveness aspect of it means to you personally, because it seems that obviously you didn't define him solely based on what happened that night in the same way that you said earlier that I haven't defined you based on what happened, and I don't think anybody should be defined by one event or anything like that. At the same time as that, what essentially made you make the decision to forgive him and turn it into a positive? Because the reason I ask this is obviously that was the start, that was the catalyst for everything that came later, TED Talks, the book, everything you're doing now. But it could have easily gone a different way. It could have easily gone, I want to press charges against you. I hear what you're saying, that wasn't recognized in the law at that time, but at the same time, there possibly still could have been an avenue to go down. So what at that time enabled you to take one path instead of another, basically? That's the question in its simplest form.
Right. Well, there was never a focus on forgiveness, essentially not from my perspective, but it was certainly a byproduct. I did not set off on this journey hell-bent on forgiving Tom. I set off on this journey hell-bent on healing. And healing meant for me to rid myself of all the self-blame that I carried, that I think is a result of so much of victim blaming notions that we grow up with, and so much conditioning that women undergo from an early age, where we are made responsible for our own safety. We are taught from such an early age to not be in certain places, not wear certain things, not, drink, not party, not flirt, not be alone after dark. The list is endless, right? So when disaster strikes anyway, and someone chooses to abuse you, let's not forget that is someone's choice. Many of us end up feeling like we failed because we, despite all this training that we had, all this conditioning that we should be responsible for our safety, we did not manage to do so, and we were victimized regardless. And of course, all of this is deeply unfair. Of course, this transfers that responsibility from the person that should be assigned it, to whom it belongs, over to the person that is not only subject to the crime, but then also has to shoulder the weight of it, the weight of the onus, so to speak. So if that for me was the aim, forgiveness came naturally because Tom was just so unwaveringly willing to own up to his deeds and to listen to the consequences that it had had for me, to understand the magnitude and the gravity of the hurts. And when someone is operating from that place and you get to sort of empty yourself of all the hurt, then there comes a time where your anger just sort of distinguishes, because it doesn't serve a purpose anymore. There's no purpose in maintaining anger towards a person that is not causing you harm anymore and is on the contrary trying their best to make it up to you and become a better person. For me, it started to feel self-indulgent, and not just self-indulgent, but just a waste of energy. Because let's not forget, anger is taxing. It's emotionally taxing. It's hard work to maintain anger at someone that is basically taking all the oxygen from that fire, if that metaphor makes sense. So I thought, I could use this space in my mind, this mental capacity, this emotional space and fill it with more constructive feelings that give me joy, that, help my relationships, that mend my self-image. I could use this for something else. So it just made perfect sense to cut that tie and forgive Tom. It came, as I said, naturally. It was a result of a very long journey, but my anger was necessary, and it's a vital part of the story. The fact that I did have bitterness, the fact that I did wish him ill. I mean, I was not above that. I was not above wishing that he would experience a level of hurt similar to that he had caused me. I mean, all of these are very, I think, human emotions to have, and I certainly went through all of that spectrum, and this is where I ended up. I think it's important to also state that I don't think there's one way to go through a healing journey, and I don't think we all end up at the same destination. I think for some people, anger is the place that feels safest for them, and they linger there, and some of them end up being there their whole lives, and that's an empowering place for them to be, because it helps them remember where the responsibility lies, and it brings them, it's an energizing feeling. And that's a certain personality that it serves. And then there are people that just don't have that same makeup, that have different emotional needs, and I happen to be one of them. But I just want to make it known that I feel it's incredibly important for survivors to hear it said repeatedly, that there is no right or wrong way to heal, and forgiveness does not have to be part of your journey, although it was for me. But whatever feels right and safe for each individual is the best way forward for them.
Amazing, absolutely incredible. So multifaceted in the content there. Obviously, partially for the sake of time as well, but for other things. Moving on into the social change that you have caused, the positive impact that you have had in a multitude of ways, obviously with public speaking, interviews, books, playwriting, short films, so many things that I mentioned at the beginning. Obviously, it would be good to get your thoughts on how you feel that widespread social change with gender-based violence can occur, because obviously I'm aware this is a very big question, and I'm aware also that in the timescale since you and Tom and everything that happened, we've had digital world become what it is. We've had the Me Too movement. We've had quite a few things, and I'll get into a couple of those more specifically. But in terms of the social impact that you've had, in terms of some essential ingredients, if you like. If you think of it with cooking, for example, some of the essential ingredients we would need to bring about further social change. I don't mind if you look at this from some of the social change that has occurred, some of the social change that still really needs to happen in terms of people's perceptions of gender equality, a number of things you mentioned. I'm aware this is a very big subject, but what are some of the things we can do to make things better? I know it almost sounds too simple in a way to sort of put a question like that across, especially given you're already doing some of it. But I still think this could open up into something quite interesting, hence obviously asking it. So your thoughts on that, please, Loris, would be helpful.
Right. Thank you. That's, as you say, it's a massive topic and yet a simple question. But yeah, to take on that massive topic, I'm also going to give you a simple answer. And the simple answer is we change the world by changing ourselves. That's where it all starts, right? That's where it begins. So, I mean, I've worked for institutional change. I've been on advisory boards with action plans for national governments and written legislation, stuff like that. But honestly, that's not what makes the biggest impact. What makes the biggest impact is what happens on the individual level. So I think for there to be a massive shift in the area of gender equality, we would need for people like you and me, everyone basically, to, look inside themselves and think, how can I be instrumental in this change? And what am I doing to shift things? And what am I doing that maybe inadvertently maintains the status quo? Because we all do that. Let's not forget that we're all born into this context. So we're not born into a vacuum, of course. So growing up, we are bombarded with, all kinds of messages. Some of them become subliminal about what a woman is, what a man is, the gender system, the binary, what is appropriate, inappropriate, what a perfect woman is or a perfect man, all these essentially stereotypes that end up hampering us and end up limiting the opportunities that we have in life and how we also just interact with one another. So honestly, I think a lot of the violence that we see that women are subject to are a result of this mindset that I think is deeply rooted in our culture. For example, when Donald Trump, a few years back, when he was found to have had this shocking conversation that was leaked, where he was talking about grabbing women's genitals, which is essentially sexual assault, and was confronted with it, obviously, because it was all over the press. Then his reaction was to deflect this by not just downplaying it and minimizing it, but literally ascribing it to male culture, locker room talk, that it was just a normal part of being a man. That this is how you talk about women, this is how you value them, essentially, treat them. And with that mindset, you have just justified, basically, sexually assaulting women. And I think when the world's most powerful man sends out that message, it can do a whole lot of damage and seed a whole lot of violence that could have been prevented. So I do think that attitudes like that are key. I mean, they're key to uproot if we are going to see any meaningful shifts. And how to uproot those attitudes is another question, but I think that the Me Too movement opened that dialogue on an unprecedented scale by making us think about not just how incredibly widespread harassment and violence and abuse towards women and girls is, but also how insidious it can be, how mundane it is, how it's everywhere, how it's, at the workplace, in school, it's on public transport, it's even in, hospitals, and it's basically all encompassing. And that's another thing that I think would result in a shift if people open their eyes to, that it's not just, in bad places committed by bad people. It's basically everywhere, and it's committed by all kinds of people. So these mindset shifts, these attitude shifts would be a massive first step, if we each and individually just took them to heart and committed to being a part of the positive change we want to see.
Yeah, that is incredible, because I know when I asked that it's a big question, but absolutely changing the mindset, changing these entrenched, rigid beliefs that people have had that really surpass generations. I mean, they do go from one generation to another. It's a big process. It's definitely happening, I would say, although it is certainly a work in progress. On the subject of changes, on the subject of coming up sort of to the present day, to the future, you mentioned about when we were emailing, when we were setting this up, about the digital side of things, in terms of how different the world is in that way now compared to obviously when you and Tom were together, and everything that happened. Um, that does change the playing field quite a bit, to say that that's probably an understatement. It completely reshapes the playing field in so many ways. Um, this is something I'd like to get into as well, because people who experience sexual violence, abuse, anything like this now, it can obviously come in digital forms. I know you're very interested in this. This is something you work with as well. So, to get your thoughts on some of the changes in this context, be them positive or negative, I can see two sides to it, where, in a way, the digitization of the world has allowed things like the Me Too movement and things like that to actually spread, and actually become possible to a degree. But at the same time, there's a negative side where people can be um, effectively preyed upon or abused digitally. So this one, again, it's another big question, I know, but it's something that I think is, we can't overlook with the world is a different place now. Can you share with us some of your thoughts on this? I don't mind where you go with this, if it's the positive side, the negative side. But as you mentioned to me when we were setting this up, it absolutely bears mentioning.
Right. So just to make sure I understand the question, my thoughts on how digitalization has shaped.
Well, how digital? It's another big one. I know it's a big one, and I thought, well, the best way
Well,
to
if we're looking at how it's shaped violence, I can definitely get into that. But did you have any?
let's start there. Let's start
Okay.
there, because I definitely think that's something that's very important to you, and I think it's something that is
Yeah.
very, very topical as well, because of how the world has changed from your experiences, say with Tom, would be totally different now. So let's start with that side of it. I think would be a good place. Yeah.
Yeah, I love those two angles. Let's do both of them. But let's start with, yeah, how digitalization has shaped and, in some cases, aided gender inequality and gender-based violence. Yes, there is the upside of the internet and the positives, and I love the internet. Big fan. Couldn't live a day without it. And so much of our existence now is via the internet. I mean, we do online banking, we order our clothes and food and all of that jazz. Our entertainment, it's all online. So that said, there are of course these dark aspects, and as you mentioned, it's given like a megaphone to bullies. It's given a megaphone to people that are out to cause hurt and harm. In some ways, that manifests in ways online that are highly gendered. One thing would be the infamous dick pic, right? There's hardly a young woman today that hasn't received one. And this is, of course, just a cyber flashing, basically. I mean, it's someone exposing their genitals to you without you having any interest in that activity. So that does things to people. If you're treated that way repeatedly, it desensitizes and dehumanizes people. So that, of course, is one thing that comes to my mind in terms of ways that gender-based violence is manifested online. Another way is nude photos being shared without consent. And again, that's an activity that is targeting women and girls overwhelmingly. And neither of these, I think, these examples I've given would exist if there wasn't a certain way in which we view female sexuality. We weaponize it, basically, is what we do. And by saying so, I mean how we slut shame women who are sexually active. And by slut shaming women who are sexually active, a nude photo of them or sex tape becomes a weapon. Because if we then share it without her consent, we have the power to, quote unquote, ruin her or ruin her reputation. And this, of course, makes women and girls very vulnerable because no one wants their reputation ruined. So women and girls are being abused horrifically by individuals who end up with material such as a nude photo. If that ends up in the wrong hands of an abuser, then they can torment their victims tremendously. And unfortunately, there are a number of stories that result in suicide of victims that didn't see a way out because of the nature of the internet. Because the internet, I won't say it doesn't forget, because it can forget, and there is something called the right to be forgotten, which means that essentially your Google footprint can be erased and you can start afresh. But it is a place that is everywhere. You can never escape from it. And I definitely sympathize with this feelings of inescapability and being trapped that victims of digital violence experience, and how it's never ending for them. So those are some of the more grave, I think, areas of online abuse that we should be mindful of, and we should be talking about, and we should be countering, and we should be educating children about, and we should be raising the public awareness about. But there's also, more sort of run-of-the-mill stuff like hate speech and sexism in the public discourse, which is also very detrimental. We see that female politicians and female journalists are being abused far more than their male counterparts. And this is just research. And I have fresh research out of the Nordic region, being the chairperson of the Nordic Digital Rights and Equality Foundation, that proves this just very clearly. And that is a deep concern for me, because it ultimately results in women leaving journalism and politics. And that is a threat to democracy, because democracy cannot exist if it doesn't represent the population. So we should also be alarmed and doing our best to reverse that development that is unfortunately on the rise. We know that incel sites, which are the most insidious, misogynistic, hate speech sites online, that are defined as terrorist groups in quite a few places in the world, because they have committed mass murders, and at least 50 people have been killed in the last 5 years by these extreme misogynists. Incel movements are on the rise, and some of the bigger sites have grown 40 times since 2019, and that's a fresh statistic from the Swedish Department of Defense. So there are definitely worrying signs, which we should all take to heart, and we should all be mindful of what type of online environment do we want to foster, and when are we contributing to an environment that's not constructive, that may be feeding ground for prejudice and discrimination. And sometimes we hide behind tolerance, and we say, well, there should just be a tolerance of opinions. But I think that putting some limitations on the freedom of speech is actually protecting freedom of speech, because a few bad apples that are preaching hate can silence so many other voices that are necessary to a democracy. So it is a fine line, but there's a lot to think about there. And the other aspect of the question was about Tom and me, and how that obviously that reality did not exist back then. But I've often entertained the idea, like, how would our story, how could it have been different had we lived in that era? And so much could have been different. I mean, like most teenagers today, we would probably have had some form of romantic communication through online exchanges. We might have been sexting, for example. Had we been, then both of us would have been vulnerable to that material being shared without our consent. Some of it may have been considered evidence had, you know, a legal course of action been taken. Had I been impulsive of a 16-year-old feeling the way I was feeling, and being hurt and betrayed, I could have stated something online about him being a rapist, for example, and that could have reaped me prosecution for slander, for example, which we are seeing worryingly much, I think, in places around me. For example, in Sweden, we've seen many women been convicted of slander for stating that they've been the victim of a crime that has been proven. So there are cases in Sweden where women have been sexually assaulted, their assailant has been found guilty and gone to jail. And when they talk about it publicly, write about it online, for example, have a blog site or in a Facebook group, they're still found guilty of slander, because there's so much focus on protecting people's reputation, even if you're a criminal. So, I mean, I think that is obviously a big area for concern. But yes, it's certainly crossed my mind multiple times how there's both a blessing and a curse embedded in the fact that I did not grow up with the internet as a part of my reality.
Absolutely. I mean, when I brought that up, it's a massive topic. I mean, and I was aware of that when I mentioned this, but at the same time, the positives and the negatives, it's a wonderful answer to that question. In so many ways, actually. In the one sense, it's brought people together so much. In the other space, it's given everybody a voice, and some of those are just not very good. Like you mentioned, Donald Trump. I don't know if you've seen, you've got the Andrew Tate thing going on at the moment, what he's saying, things like that. People like that should be silenced, obviously. But at the same time, the change that it's brought about, Your Life Enter Now, is fantastic. Moving into the last couple of things for time, and if we run over, just let me know. Like you mentioned you would. Moving into the last couple of things, one thing that I'd like to get your thoughts on as well is to actually flip this on its head slightly, because you're bringing about change in how women are treated, how women view themselves, taking the wrongfully placed blame off their shoulders. All of these, so many different things that we've gone through. Obviously, the work that you're doing, the Me Too movement itself as a broader entity and so forth, these have also, I believe, had an impact on men as well, and changing stereotypes and viewpoints around that. I've certainly seen that in recent years as well. So flipping it on its head as well, on your thoughts on how stereotypical concepts of masculinity may be changing as well. I think that's a big one, because when we've talked so far about even things with, like we mentioned about Trump, and sort of dismissing that as locker room talk and this, that, and the other, it again, it has a stereotypical basis of, you know, men think this way, they act this way, so on and so forth. Again, it seems to be the theme of the evening with or the afternoon, with quite big questions. But I think it would be great, in your experience with all of the different things you've done working on gender equality at the highest level, what are some of the changes you've seen in the masculine side of of things, basically.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that question. I think there's been a lot of improvement and a lot of things that inspire and give me hope. I think that when I first started this work, more than 15 years ago, there was hardly a male voice in the field. And I found that very frustrating because gender-based violence is at the hands of men 9 out of 10 times, if not more. So obviously the people behind the problem need to be part of the solution, or we won't have a solution. It's that simple. But now, fast forward 15 years, I feel that there's a lot more engagement on behalf of men. Certainly here in the Nordic region, it's become mainstream for men to be feminists and to pride themselves with that. And sometimes I guess it's only skin deep, as it is with all ideology. We can call ourselves a lot of things and not live up to the name. But that is a shift that I felt. Like 15, 20 years ago, a man would never label himself a feminist. I think in sort of mainstream politics or people in the public arena, but now they certainly do. So that's a change that comes immediately to my mind. I also feel that men and boys are more critical about what masculinity is. They're expanding that concept. I find that really encouraging and really constructive. I feel that young men today are not happy about having such a confined emotional space, that they are only allowed a limited set of expressions, emotional expressions, because anything else is considered unmanly. So I feel that young men today are less afraid to take back sort of their emotional autonomy and redefine what it means to be a man. That like a man can be a good dad, he can cry, can be sad, can be sensitive, can be in touch with his emotions, and none of that makes him less of a man. So that gives me hope, and that makes me happy, and it makes me glad for my 3 sons, because I have no less than 3 sons. And I certainly want for them to live in a world where they can be everything that they encompass. They can play out all of their emotions and be multifaceted, complex, nuanced people that live meaningful lives and are not emotionally stunted by a box that was never comfortable in the first place, that they felt they had to fit into in order to live up to a stereotypical notion about what it means to be a man. So those are certainly 2 things that come to my mind about what has been sort of brewing in the masculine arena in this area.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is changing, and it's changing from, as you say, from a very sort of narrow view of what a man should be to being a much broader, much broader topic. And I just felt we ought to, we had to give that a mention on both sides for the completion. Moving into the last area really of this talk, because like I say, hopefully we've got into some different viewpoints that people are not as used to hearing from you. Obviously, your future plans. I mean, we've got into, we've touched on some of the amazing work you're doing. I mean, to be honest, there's a lot more we could go into. I wish we could, with short films and some of the incredible things you've been doing. But in terms of where you'd like to take this over the next however many years, I don't really have a time scale on the question, but whether it's 2 years, 5 years, some of the changes that you'd like to see, some of the projects or ideas that you're working on, if you're able to discuss them. Again, it's a broad question, but really we've seen progress being made in the gender equality area in some ways. I will say that obviously there are issues, as you said, about the internet side of things, and certain things that then have grown up and they need to be addressed. But there is a lot more awareness, there's a lot more openness than there used to be. Where would you like to see that going in the future, whether it's through your own work directly or whether it is broadly as a social movement? Obviously, now we've had the Me Too movement develop to the size and scope that it is. That will have next steps to it. So, your dreams for the future, essentially, is the question. I know it's another big one, but it's a good one to
Right.
get into.
Wow. How much time do we have? Sort of. No,
I've
I
lost track.
mean, oh, I mean, there's so much. I am really excited about how we are demolishing boxes. I was sort of already talking about that in my last answer. But, demolishing these outdated boxes that are holding us back, that really excites me. I also think we can take so many leaves out of the book of the non-binary trans movement, for example, that are redefining what it means to be a human being and sort of leaving behind this male-female gender binary. And I think that's fascinating because, again, we've been talking so much about violence today. And I think so much of that violence could have been prevented had there been ideas that had allowed people that were conditioned to become, to be continually proving themselves through domination, for example, to be continually proving themselves through assertiveness that leads into aggression. These are some of the, I think, notions that young men are fed, that they need to be continually proving their manhood, right? And by doing acts that can easily become abusive. And that's on us. Like, that's our fault. We created that idea. And it's our responsibility, our joint responsibility, to dismantle that and just throw it away and burn that shit to the ground and say we want a new idea of what it is to be a human being. And that's why I think it's inspiring to see the trans and non-binary movement just stepping out of that, of the notions of what it means to be a man or a woman, and just allowing themselves to venture into uncharted territory that is our birthright, because everyone that is born onto this planet has a right to experience all feelings, to express themselves in all different ways. It should not be limited to what's between your legs. And certainly if it starts to emotionally stunt you to the point where the only way to lash out is through violence, then we've set ourselves up for abuse and failure. So that's something I would like to see more of in the future. I would also like to see people take back the internet as the fantastic venue that it has the potential to be, because we do have violence and oppression offline. We have all these systems of discrimination, based on race and religion and ableism. Like, we have so many ways of discriminating, and here we have this new venue that's brand new in the history of the human race, and we can make it anything. We don't have to import these oppressive structures there. So I think we should be vigilant about it. We should make high demands on what type of online world we want to create, because we have a say. And yes, we have a say in the offline world as well, but that's more ingrained, right? But this is new, it's still being shaped, and we can all put our mark on it.
What a fantastic answer that is. It's again, because I know it's a big question. I know I keep saying that, but a few things I've asked today, they have been very broad in their scope, and particularly the avenue we choose to go down. But I think that has led to some absolutely fantastic topics being covered, and hopefully getting into the deeper side of things as well. Because the way I look at it, obviously, there's you and your story of where you come from, but the work you're doing with it for the world, it's partially about yourself and your healing, but it's so much bigger. So getting into that side of it has been a real pleasure. I think we're about up on time, or maybe even a little bit over. I'm not sure. I've actually lost track because it's been so much fun getting into this. With that being said, I'd like to thank you for coming on the show. I mean, wrapping this up, it's been an absolute pleasure. Um, like I say, hopefully we've got into some things that are a little bit different. They're not the stereotypical things that people ask you about, because I definitely feel that the work you're doing, it depends how you look at it. It's on levels, it's in layers, depending on how you look at it. The forgiveness, the work with Tom, that's had a massive impact. But I don't see the work you're doing as defined by that. I think it's so much bigger, and there's a lot more to come as well, to be honest. So, absolute pleasure. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being so open about everything that you've shared. And before we wrap this up, is there anything else you'd like to say to your supporters around the world, to the people who follow you and support you, to anyone, whether they're hearing your story for the first time today, or whether they are your army of light? I think you call it a wonderful name as well. Anyone like that? Any final words for them? Is pretty much the last thing.
I do have one last thing I want to say. Thank you for holding the space for that. And it's for you. So I want to say to you, what, spotlight's on me? No, but I want to say to you, it's so important that men of your generation have these conversations. And as a result, it's of so much worth that you're using your platform this way. It's so valuable. It's what we need. So my last words are for you, Liam. Thank you for inviting me to have this conversation, and for you to use your voice to lift these issues. It's incredibly important, and that's the way forward.
Well, thank you. I mean, that's a wonderful compliment. Actually, that's made my day. It's made my week, actually. I mean, I won't get into that, but it's not been an easy time. But no, that's really wonderful, and obviously you're very welcome. It's been a pleasure both ways. I mean, I've personally actually learned and taken away some things from this conversation, but on a bigger picture level, I hope by getting this out there, it does continue to have an impact. And really, you know, my aim is is quite simple. It is to get people thinking. You know, it is to get people. It's not to put on people this way, that way. This is the way to think. That's the way to think. It's just to get people to question. Well, you know, is that the right way of doing it? Is that the right way of doing it? Should I think about this from a different point of view? Should I think? And that begins to break down some of these rigid, entrenched concepts that we've been talking about. It begins to sort of really broaden the horizons, and what's possible from there, who can say? But the first step is really to break down those sort of constraints on people's thinking, really. So the fact you think that I'm doing that, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. That's a really wonderful compliment. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe to the Simply Inspired YouTube channel, and there'll be more videos coming soon.